Picture this, the medieval Christian imagination, consumed by a singular terror, not the flames of hellfire alone, not the wailing of the damned, but something far more primordial. Deep beneath the chaos of the infernal realm, beneath even the thrones of hell's greatest princes, there moves an ancient intelligence. A creature so vast that its breath creates whirlpools. Its eyes burn with the accumulated malice of every envious thought ever conceived. Its scales are impervious to mortal weapons. Its very existence represents not merely punishment, but cosmic rebellion against divine order. This is Leviathan, and understanding this creature means understanding one of Christianity's most profound anxieties about human nature itself. When we think of the 7 deadly sins and their respective demons, certain names immediately surface in popular consciousness. Lucifer as pride, Beelzebub as gluttony, Asmodeus as lust. But Leviathan occupies a strange, often overlooked corner of Christian demonology, assigned the sin of envy. And this assignment, seemingly obscure compared to the more dramatic sins, actually reveals something remarkable about medieval theology and how Christian thinkers understood the most corrosive, invisible forms of human corruption. The story of Leviathan doesn't begin with Christian theology at all. It begins with ancient Hebrew literature, with a creature described in terms so grandiose and terrifying that medieval theologians would spend centuries trying to make sense of it. The Book of Job presents Leviathan as perhaps the most fearsome creature in all creation, a being that makes even the great war horse seem insignificant. The text describes it with almost obsessive detail. Its scales like shields, its eyes like the eyelids of dawn, its sneezing producing light, its breath kindling coals, fire flashing from its mouth. This wasn't a demon, this was something worse. This was chaos itself, given form and appetite. In the original Hebrew, Leviathan carries the name Leviathan, possibly derived from a root meaning to twist or to coil. Ancient Near Eastern mythology knew versions of this creature under different names. Yam in Ugaritic texts, representing the primordial chaos waters that had to be defeated for creation to exist. The Babylonians had Tiamat, the monstrous mother of the gods, slain to create the world from her corpse. These weren't mere animals. They were metaphysical forces, embodiments of the untamed, unordered nature that preceded divine civilization. But here's where Christianity complicated things. As Christian theology matured throughout the medieval period, theologians inherited these ancient texts and faced a profound interpretive problem. If Leviathan was a real creature, which medieval exegetes generally believed it was, then where did it fit in the cosmic hierarchy? If it served God during creation, did it now serve the devil? And more importantly, what did this ancient chaos monster have to do with the orderly arrangement of hell that Christian thinkers were constructing? The answer that emerged was subtle and theologically sophisticated. Medieval demonologists, particularly working through the philosophical frameworks developed by Thomas Aquinas, began to understand the 7 deadly sins not merely as actions, but as spiritual states, corruptions of the soul that aligned with specific demonic intelligences. These weren't arbitrary pairings. They were supposed to reflect something essential about how each demon operated and what form of spiritual disease it embodied. For Leviathan, the assignment was envy, but not casual envy, not the momentary sting of wanting what another possesses. Medieval theology understood envy as something far more devastating. The refusal to rejoice in another's good. It was the fundamental inability to acknowledge goodness outside oneself. In Latin, it was called invidia, often translated as envy, but carrying connotations closer to seeing into someone with malicious intent. The envious person doesn't merely want what another has. They actively resent that the other person has it at all. They would rather see it destroyed than see someone else enjoy it. This understanding places Leviathan at the center of a specific kind of spiritual warfare. Consider the mechanics. Pride sees itself as superior. Greed accumulates. Wrath destroys. But envy is the sin that poisons joy itself. An envious person cannot celebrate another's achievement without feeling diminished. They cannot witness another's happiness without experiencing it as a personal wound. And in medieval theology, this psychological corruption had a demonic architect. Leviathan didn't merely encourage people to sin. Leviathan systematically undermined the capacity for genuine human flourishing by destroying the possibility of communal joy. The ancient texts supported this interpretation, medieval scholars argued, because Leviathan's very nature reflected this principle. Leviathan moves through the waters, consuming everything, the waters being both life and the medium through which grace flows in medieval allegory. Wherever Leviathan passes, the waters are churned and made turbid. Similarly, wherever envy operates in the human community, the waters of charity and fellowship become toxic. The creature's restlessness, its inability to remain still, its constant hunger, these all paralleled how envy operates in human consciousness. The envious person can never rest, never be satisfied, never find peace. Medieval artists rendered Leviathan in ways that emphasize this psychological dimension alongside the physical. In manuscripts and cathedral carvings, Leviathan appears coiled, twisted back upon itself, a creature that could never straighten, never move forward with purpose. Its jaws gape impossibly wide, as if consuming itself as much as the world around it. The iconography emphasized paradox. The strongest creature was also the most self-defeating. The ancient chaos monster had become something else entirely, a symbol of how envy works within the soul. Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 14th century, contributed significantly to Leviathan's place in Christian demonology through the Divine Comedy. Though Dante doesn't assign Leviathan a specific circle of hell in the way some demonological texts do, he portrays hell as a structure carefully designed by divine justice, with each punishment proportionate to each sin. The very geography of hell reflects a theology of spiritual corruption. Lust floats in wind, gluttony lies in filth, greed hoards and guards treasure obsessively, and envy, Dante suggests, involves a specific form of torment that renders the envious unable to look upon others. This matters because it shows how Christian theology was actively reshaping the inherited mythology of Leviathan. The ancient text's chaos monster was being reinterpreted through a lens of moral psychology. Leviathan became less a threat to cosmic order and more a diagnosis of spiritual pathology. The creature's vastness and power now symbolized how thoroughly envy could corrupt a person's inner world, consuming them from within. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theological systematizer of the medieval period, approached the connection between demons and sins through careful philosophical analysis. In the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas asks, "Are demons themselves prone to the sins they encourage in humans?" His answer was complex. Demons, as purely spiritual beings, couldn't sin in the physical manner of embodied creatures, but they could sin spiritually through fundamental opposition to divine will. And if envy is understood as the refusal to acknowledge goodness, to grudge against the good itself, then demons would be fundamentally envious. They hate the good. They cannot tolerate that goodness exists outside themselves. For Aquinas and his successors, Leviathan's assignment to envy made profound theological sense. The creature that represents ultimate rebellion against created order, that still contends against the waters of life itself, that is the very embodiment of the refusal to let goodness flourish. And so Leviathan became, in Christian demonology, not merely an ancient chaos monster converted into a devil, but something more carefully constructed, the pattern demon of envy, the creature whose very nature demonstrates what envy does to a being. Medieval literature expanded these interpretations through narrative. Religious texts described Leviathan as the keeper of those souls bound by envy. The creature didn't merely punish them, it embodied the logic of their torment. In hell, the envious would be placed where they could see others' goodness and joy, but remain unable to participate in it, rendered spectators to a joy they could not enter. Some texts suggested Leviathan itself moved through hell's darkest depths, not in proud domination, but in eternal, frustrated hunger, its vast power useless to achieve what it actually craved. One particularly important medieval tradition, preserved in texts like the Testament of Solomon, portrayed Leviathan as bound in specific ways. This wasn't merely physical binding, but spiritual containment. The creature was held by knowledge of its own futility. It thrashed eternally, but its thrashing accomplished nothing. This rendered Leviathan simultaneously the mightiest of demons and the most pathetic, trapped not by superior force, but by the very nature of what it represented. Envy consumes itself. The envious creature is ultimately its own prison. The visual tradition surrounding Leviathan in medieval and Renaissance art reflects these theological developments. In the famous depiction in Revelation commentary manuscripts, Leviathan appears not as a lone dragon monster, but as part of an economy of damnation. Its scales are sometimes depicted as mirrors, reflecting the faces of the envious back to themselves, suggesting that what the envious see is always themselves, unable to look outward to others' genuine good. Some artists rendered Leviathan's jaws as the mouth of hell itself, following an interpretation that connected the chaos creature directly to the infernal pit. The iconographic language of Hellmouth, which became increasingly common in medieval religious art, sometimes featured Leviathan as either the creature that formed the mouth itself or as the creature that presided over the threshold. These weren't decorative choices. They represented a theological claim that envy is the gateway sin through which other corruptions enter the soul. Pride leads to greed. Greed leads to wrath. But envy, by destroying the envious person's ability to find joy in any good not directly possessed, opens them to every other form of spiritual corruption. By the High Middle Ages, Christian demonology had settled into its most articulate forms. The system assigned each of the 7 deadly sins a specific demon prince. Leviathan's assignment to envy, though sometimes disputed or rearranged in different texts, became increasingly standard. Other demons might be assigned to Leviathan's roles. Sometimes Asmodeus or Beleth or other entities took the position, but the sophisticated theological tradition that developed around Leviathan and envy remained distinctive. What made Leviathan's association with envy particularly compelling was how it transformed understanding of the sin itself. Before this association, envy might be understood as merely wanting what others have, but connected to Leviathan, envy became cosmologically significant. It became the refusal to acknowledge the good itself. It became a kind of anti-creation force, similar to how Leviathan itself represented chaos preceding creation. The envious person was not merely doing something wrong. They were siding with cosmic forces opposed to order, goodness, and flourishing itself. This had practical implications for medieval Christian life. Confessors and spiritual directors used this framework to help penitents understand their soul's condition. If someone struggled with envy, they were being encouraged to see it not as a personal character flaw, but as a spiritual pathology with cosmic dimensions. They were being positioned, in a sense, as aligned with Leviathan, the greatest of chaos monsters. This wasn't meant to paralyze them with shame, but to help them understand the gravity of the sin and the absolute necessity of grace to overcome it. The medieval understanding of Leviathan and envy also served another function. It provided a way to talk about social and political corruption. Medieval kingdoms were structured hierarchically, with everyone occupying a specific position in a divinely ordained order. Envy threatened this order at its root because it prevented people from accepting their station. If a nobleman envied a higher nobleman, or a peasant envied nobility, they weren't merely experiencing a personal emotion. They were aligned with Leviathan, the creature opposed to order itself. This made envy not just a personal sin but a political and social danger. Some medieval political theorists explicitly used demonological language to describe factional conflict driven by envy. When nobles plotted against the crown because they resented another's position, they were described as being influenced by Leviathan. When ambition led people to undermine communal peace, Leviathan was invoked as the underlying spiritual force. This language wasn't merely rhetorical. It shaped how people understood and categorized conflict. Envy was perhaps the most politically dangerous of the deadly sins because it could disguise itself as justice or reform, while actually serving only destructive ends. As Christianity encountered and absorbed other cultural traditions, particularly through crusades, trade, and increasingly sophisticated theological dialogue, Leviathan's image continued to evolve. The creature absorbed elements from Islamic demonology, from Neoplatonic philosophy, from increasingly sophisticated natural philosophy. Some Renaissance thinkers began to wonder whether Leviathan might be a literal, physical creature that could be studied naturally. This raised fascinating questions about how a cosmic demon might manifest physically. Could it be one of the great sea creatures being discovered through expanding maritime exploration? Some speculated that whales or giant squids might be Leviathan, or creatures yet undiscovered in the deepest oceans. The Protestant Reformation brought new scrutiny to medieval demonological traditions. Some Protestant theologians questioned whether the entire system of assigning specific sins to specific demons was too elaborate, too speculative. They emphasized returning to Scripture and moving away from what they saw as excessive scholastic complexity. Yet, even Protestant theologians continued to recognize Leviathan in biblical texts and continued to understand envy as a particularly grave spiritual danger. The association between the creature and the sin persisted, even as the theological framework containing it underwent reformation. The early modern period saw an explosion of demonological treatises, many attempting to organize and systematize knowledge about demons in ways influenced by both medieval scholasticism and emerging scientific methodologies. Works like the Malleus Maleficarum discussed demons and their operations in ways that reflected both traditional theology and emerging concerns about witchcraft and demonic influence. Leviathan appears in these texts as one of the princes of hell, with various authors debating its specific roles and relationships to other demons. What's particularly interesting about early modern treatments is how they grapple with Leviathan's apparent overlap with Lucifer and Satan himself. Medieval texts sometimes positioned Leviathan as second only to Satan in the infernal hierarchy. Yet, they also recognize that Satan/Lucifer's sin is pride, not envy. This led to sophisticated discussions about how demons could embody multiple sins, or how Leviathan might be understood as a particular aspect or manifestation of diabolic power. Some authors suggested that Leviathan represents Satan's envy toward God and creation, the fundamental rebellion that generated all other demonic sins. By the 18th century, the systematic study of demonology began to decline in educated circles as theological attention shifted and scientific worldviews increasingly marginalized supernatural entities. Yet, Leviathan maintained a presence in literature and popular imagination. Romantic-era writers found the creature appealing precisely because of its association with chaos and primal forces that Enlightenment rationalism attempted to suppress. Leviathan became a symbol not merely of demonic evil, but of the untamed, chaotic dimensions of existence that rational systems couldn't contain. Thomas Hobbes famously used Leviathan as the title and central metaphor for his political philosophy, published in 1651. Hobbes's Leviathan wasn't explicitly demonic, but it drew on the creature's association with chaos and the necessity of power to contain it. The natural state of mankind, Hobbes argued, is war, and only a powerful sovereign, a Leviathan, could impose order. This appropriation shows how thoroughly Leviathan had entered European intellectual culture. The creature's name could be used to reference both demonic chaos and the powerful force necessary to prevent chaos, depending on context. Modern scholarship on Christian demonology has provided new perspectives on Leviathan's role. Contemporary religious historians note that the assignment of specific sins to specific demons wasn't uniform across all medieval Christian traditions. Different regions, different monastic communities, different theological schools sometimes proposed different arrangements. Yet, Leviathan's association with envy remained remarkably consistent, suggesting that this pairing had particular theological resonance. In contemporary religious studies and theology, Leviathan appears occasionally in discussions of theodicy and the problem of evil. Some theologians have used Leviathan imagery to help explain how evil operates not as straightforward temptation, but as systematic corrosion of human capacity for goodness. The creature becomes a way of talking about how sins can be structured, how they can create systems and patterns that perpetuate themselves. Envy, as Leviathan's domain, is particularly useful because envy tends to perpetuate itself. Each act of envious destruction generates more envy in response. The popular cultural legacy of Leviathan is complex. While most contemporary people might not immediately connect the creature to envy, many know Leviathan through references in fantasy literature, video games, and modern fiction. Often, these portrayals emphasize the creature's physical power and ancient origins, while largely abandoning the theological sophistication of medieval understandings. Yet, occasionally, contemporary works engage more seriously with the traditional meanings. Some modern theological works, particularly those engaging with demonic forces or exploring the spiritual dimensions of sin, continue to reference the traditional understanding of Leviathan and envy. Spiritual warfare literature, renewal movement theology, and various forms of contemporary Christian mysticism still draw on these medieval frameworks. The creature remains, for some Christians, a vivid representation of how envy operates as a spiritual force. The psychological insights embedded in the medieval association of Leviathan with envy are worth highlighting separately. Medieval theologians, working from careful observation of human nature and spiritual psychology, understood that envy is indeed one of the most corrosive and self-perpetuating sins. The envious person cannot celebrate genuine good. They cannot rest in satisfaction because satisfaction depends on acknowledging that something outside themselves is valuable. The very structure of envy involves a kind of cosmic rebellion against the existence of good apart from oneself. This psychological insight remains valid regardless of one's stance on demonology. Modern psychology would likely use different language, but the observation that envy is uniquely destructive of happiness and community stands firm. The person envying another poisons their own well more thoroughly than anyone else's. Their torture is, in a sense, self-inflicted, and this matches the medieval description of Leviathan in hell, the mightiest creature, rendered powerless by the very nature of what it represents. The contrast between Leviathan and other sin demons is also illuminating. A glutton at least experiences pleasure, however disordered. A wrathful person experiences the intensity of powerful emotion, but an envious person experiences only deprivation. The envious person cannot enjoy what they have because they're focused on what others have. They cannot enjoy others' joy because they resent it. Their consciousness becomes a prison of perpetual dissatisfaction, a churning void that can never be filled. Much like medieval depictions of Leviathan itself, eternally restless and hungry. Understanding Leviathan as the demon prince of envy thus teaches us something about how medieval Christian theology understood evil itself. Evil wasn't understood merely as chaos or rebellion, though it involved both. Evil was understood as a systematic corruption of human capacity for flourishing. And the particular genius of Leviathan as envy's embodiment is that it represents evil's most subtle and self-defeating form. Leviathan is powerful enough to disrupt all order, yet it's also trapped in patterns of self-destruction that guarantee its ultimate futility. The creature that challenged God itself can do nothing but churn helplessly in the depths. This theological vision offered medieval Christian consciousness something profound, a way of understanding that even the mightiest evil contains within itself the seeds of its own defeat. The envious person, aligned with the greatest of demons, nonetheless holds the seeds of their own suffering within their very disposition. The path to liberation lay not in matching Leviathan's power, but in relinquishing the envy that Leviathan embodies and encourages. And the Christian promise was that grace could accomplish this transformation, breaking the chains of envious comparison and opening the soul to genuine joy in others' good and one's own peace. As we continue to navigate moral and spiritual challenges in contemporary contexts, the medieval vision of Leviathan and envy offers something surprisingly relevant. The demon that corrupts by preventing joy, that works through the refusal to acknowledge goodness outside oneself, that perpetuates cycles of dissatisfaction and resentment. This remains a real spiritual danger. Modern technology, with its relentless comparison and exposure to others' visible success, arguably amplifies Leviathan's traditional domain. Social media, algorithmic feeds designed to provoke emotional reaction, consumer culture built on manufactured dissatisfaction. All of these create conditions where envy flourishes. Understanding Leviathan historically, theologically, and psychologically thus becomes more than antiquarian knowledge. It becomes a way of naming and confronting one of the most significant spiritual challenges facing contemporary consciousness. The ancient chaos monster, transformed by medieval theology into the specific embodiment of envy, remains a powerful symbol for understanding how sin operates and how it might be resisted. And the medieval insight that envy, despite its power, contains within itself the seeds of its own defeat. This remains a source of genuine hope and guidance for anyone struggling against its corrosive effects. The story of Leviathan is ultimately the story of how Christianity took its inherited mythology, engaged it seriously through theological reflection, and produced something new, a framework for understanding human spiritual struggle with unprecedented depth. The creature that began as chaos monster became a psychological principle. The ancient terror became a guide to understanding the soul's deepest struggles. And in doing so, medieval theology demonstrated that even our most fearsome demons can become teachers, showing us precisely where our spiritual work lies and what grace must accomplish within us. If you found this exploration of Leviathan and the theology of envy fascinating, consider subscribing to History Scrolls for more deep dives into mythology, demonology, theology, and the spiritual dimensions of history. We examine these traditions not as mere curiosities, but as profound expressions of human meaning-making and spiritual insight. Hit that subscribe button and enable notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're interested in how medieval theologians understood sin, demons, and the human soul, you'll want to watch our next episode on the complete hierarchy of hell. Thank you for scrolling through history with us.